Hey, this is Mike. Welcome to Atomics on a Friday. Thank you for checking out this demo. If you would like, subscribe and like to get more content in the future. Enjoy the demo. Let's go ahead and demo stuff. I think this is what everyone's been asking for in the DMs, and I'm getting a lot of requests for our demos.
Yeah, all the followers.
Yeah, all the followers. So yeah, it looks like we're going to start with Atomic Red Team. Look at T1569.002, which I think there's a 4 or 5 Windows tests in there, something like that. And then where you have the more recently updated Atomic Test Harness, which is pretty awesome. And some additional atomic tests that I have on my repo. Again, I'll share these links out as Paul progresses here in our demo and go from there.
Yeah.
Share it up. Do you want me to full screen you? I can do that.
Yeah, it'd be great. I'm not going to be able to see any of the stuff, so if there's like chats, just give me a whirl. Is my VMware like freaking out? Can you see that? Or is that just me?
It's a little freaking out, but it's fine. Just ship it.
All right, we'll ship it. So let's kind of jump in. That's what happens when you have too many tabs. Okay, so atomic tests. So if we did, where is it? Okay, so the first one we'll do is going to be using sc.exe to create it. So again, it will require administrative permissions. Should have had this queued up, but I did not.
Well,
has number, I think it's 2. Is 2 the correct one for SC?
SC is atomic number 1.
Number 1. Okay.
Yeah.
We're gonna leave it as is.
You could always do a show details.
I probably should have done that.
Yeah.
But here we go. So we just ripped it. And it failed. Fantastic.
But there's still an event. You still got a good event out of here because you got your service create. I'll drop this test into the chat as we're rolling here.
I totally forgot to start Sysmon too. That's what happens when you do it live. Okay, so
so yeah, I mean, I think like the simplest, if you want to do show details, that's a good walkthrough of how using like SC to create and start. Go ahead.
Yeah, so at a high level, what we're using is the service control. So it's a built-in Windows binary, and basically what it's doing is stepping in and saying, okay, I'm going to manually create one. I'm going to give it a service name. I'm going to tell it the binary path or the thing to execute, which in this case would be down here, of writing a file to, using PowerShell to write a file to the C drive. And then it would go start it, and then it deletes it. So that's kind of like the whole step through of this particular atomic test. So that's one mechanism or one way that we can use to create a service. So that's locally. Now, PowerShell also has an implementation of new service, but what's interesting is that it's hard-coded that you can't create a remote service on another endpoint. It's in, go into the PowerShell's repository because it's open source. You can look in that. It's hard-coded only for the local host, so it can't be overridden, so it stays on the local system. Whereas you could create a service remotely. ps.exe is another we're going to dig into. I can't use Atomic Red Team because I broke my lab. But what I do have is manual execution of it. So basically what I'm going to do is launch ps.exe on a remote host and launch command prompt. So what it's going to do is just go, it's going to open a handle, it's going to create the service, execute it, and then return back command prompt. Basically, now I'm acting like I interact with shell. So in this case, I can then look at the various things like host name. So as you can see, this is on the separate box that I have, as well as the user of who I'm executing as. ps.exe does allow you to specify username, password to use. You can also tell it which level. So if you want to run it as system versus whatever user context you're running in, they'll pass it through. But now let's kind of touch on.
I got 2 questions.
Yeah.
On the first atomic test that you did there for the SC creates, are you volume wise, like if an organization was just, can I go find every service create or every time someone runs sc.exe create, like is it just horrible? Like is it, how bad? I know I shouldn't alert on it, but how much noise do you think people are adding new drivers daily or process services and whatnot?
sc.exe don't have like a baseline, but that should be pretty light, especially on standard user workstations. Servers, depending on what it is, you may see that so often, depending from software installs, etc. But from a day-to-day perspective, in my opinion, it'd be probably rare to see specifically sc.exe called in that aspect. Now, again, depending on the environment, depending on what tools, software, etc., how things are working, right? If you're using ps.exec to do a lot of your traditional sysadmin stuff, then you're going to see a lot of potential service creates when we start looking at different log sources or methods to detect service creation or lateral movement from that aspect.
Cool.
That's where you run into some stuff.
Yeah, kind of interesting. And even looking at like that bin path, I was just thinking like as a detection opportunity, looking at, if you have service creation or if you can, as a previous slide we showed with 7045 service creates, I was just thinking like you could even look for, actual file paths within that bin path there. It's kind of an interesting hunt there. Even like this ps.exec calling command or even in ransomware type engagements, you see ps.exec abused and spawning a process or shipping something across using ps.exec. It's kind of a interesting avenue here.
Yeah, so actually I should probably do it on the other one. And we can touch into it a little bit. But some of the things that we can do are pipes. So because RPC needs some communication, you will have, which I forgot to include on the other one. But that's going to be one of your defaults for pipes. I don't think that's actually not the right one, but serve service is one. And then you obviously have process creates. You have registry modifications. So on the target system, what we would have seen in the registry from the sc.exe. So if we manually ran it, if I create flag in,
I'll full screen it so we can see everything here.
Service failed to create. Okay.
Oh, different name.
Golden. Okay. Now let's open up the registry editor. So as we kind of alluded to, on the local machine, under system, current control set, and then services, this is where it's stored within the registry that sc or services.exe, modify it. So what we can do is then just jump into, it's totally safe. Yep, so totally safe services. So this is the original one, and it failed because it already existed. In this case, here's the new one. So you get some basic ones. So the type is going to be its own. Start is auto. You get the object name, the image path, which is again going to be the thing that it gets executed as. The other thing it doesn't have is the display name, which you can set. So display name will be set, which would be kind of like the that's what I'm looking for. A friendly name, the thing you would see, versus sometimes if you go open up services and you jump into it, you see kind of some weird naming, but then you see like the nice friendly name next to it. That's what the display name would be, another object here. So regardless of how it gets created, at the end of the day, in the registry, that's where it's going to get stored. So regardless if you're using ps.exec, sc.exe, new service module from PowerShell, or some other tool that calls one of those, as we saw in the nice Pepe Sylvia mapping, there's probably like at least 20 that were listed there of API calls that could be used. So that's kind of interesting. Now,
did you pull up your event log yet on the Sysmon host showing the ps.exe SVC? Just kind of that, or you have that piece. So that's, yeah.
But I do have this.
Yeah.
So default, again, we get the PS.exe SVC is going to be written to the registry. Again, exact same registry hive path, and then we get the basic. So in this case, it's going to copy over PS.exec SVC. Now, a subtle difference for something like an in packet is it will write to you have your open shares, so things like admin $, IPC $, right? So anything that's open where you're going to have the administrative permissions. So just because they're open, you have to be able to write to them. And now one of the things we'll touch on later is some mitigations, specifically focusing on workstation side, because there's a couple things that could be done that may seem daunting, but will greatly reduce the attack surface, especially from a lateral movement standpoint, as well as execution standpoint, specifically with SMBs and services.
Random question. If I, as an organization, is there a decent way for me to ban the PSXE service? Say we don't use PS.exec, my admins, they don't like it. They don't use it, right? Or we removed it or something. Is there a good way for me to go and say like ban this service from ever running? Or a way for me to like track it better, or I don't know. I don't know what the right word might be, but is there a better way for me to stop this from showing up tomorrow?
Yeah, there's a few things that could be done, one of which we'll touch on is to limit the file rights inbound for those admin shares. So workstation to workstation, Jane in accounting to Mark in finance or marketing shouldn't be, using like, // host name /admin $, or even C $. So preventing workstation to workstation SMB inbound is going to greatly reduce that, because the tools that are going to write to those. Now, from the PS.exec standpoint, depending on which utilities you have, you could use EDR to block based on file name, because PS.exec uses the default. You could do binary hashes, but at that point, you're pretty much playing whack-a-mole, because there's the opportunity to potentially change the service names, the file names, different hashes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that point. GPOs, if I remember correctly, I think you can block or prevent execution in specific paths. So if you remember looking at our first sysmon, actually, I don't remember which one, but actually, no, it was this one. So if you gave it the path of, whatever your system root is, and then PS.exec service, GPO could potentially prevent that. It's been a minute since I've looked at execution blocking with GPO, but I think full path was needed to identify that. But if somebody knows the correct answer, please feel free to ship a comment and confirm that.
Yeah, I was just thinking like even like an app control type product or something, and yeah, definitely.
WDAC, I know there's, and which we did, I think in the mitigation slide, there's like attack surface reduction rules, specifically one calling out PS.exec specifically. So that makes it interesting, is that you have built-in utilities from Microsoft. WDAC is a little bit complicated. It's not just a nice point and click, but it is a valid option with WDAC or attack surface reduction rules if you have like the Defender for Endpoint stuff.
Rock on. Cool, man.
Cool. Last thing I want to touch on before we jump into the driver side of things is atomic test harnesses. So as we kind of touched on, there's multiple different ways in which you could call to create a service. And so if we only focus on the tool, we're potentially missing different data sources that we could use for trying to identify service creation, service execution. So atomic test harnesses was created by Red Canary, Matt Graber leading it, and Jonathan Johnson over at Spectre Ops actually pushed an update to the atomic test harness for Windows services. And the idea is to look at different depth points that you could call different ways to create a service. And so what this does is allows you to validate, okay, if I don't use sc.exe or focus on a particular tool, but the method in which they use. So in the case of sc.exe or again, PS.exec, create service W is the API function, and then we can step through that graph. We could do something like an RPC call. We could do direct registry modifications. And so what we'll do here is kind of just give you an example. If we look at the different variants, so again, direct registry modifications, sc.exe, or Win32 API call. Also, WMI is another method in which we could do it. So if we just go through and let's say verbose, maybe it'll work. And it'll go through. And now if we went and again looked, and it spits out some great information of what it does or the different components of it. So in this case, we know again, HTLM, system, current control set services, and then the service name we gave it. So what hopefully this is doing is allowing us to go and as we execute these tests, see where and at what point we can detect them. Because if we're only, again, focusing on, let's say I'm only looking at sc.exe as my detection, and I do something like use WMI, well, I potentially completely miss it, right? Or in the same case of just if I'm looking only at specific things and I do direct registry modifications. When we do direct registry modifications, there's no event logs. There's no 70, 46, 45, whatever that
45.
one is.
Yep.
Yeah, 45 or the 4697s or 4967s. Again, we wrote these in a different slide. But those are going to get bypassed depending on, again, which API calls or which API flow occurs. You could evade some of those registry creates, and especially in the case of a direct registry modification, there will be no service was created. Now, the interesting thing about doing it with registry is that it requires a reboot of the system in order for it to be registered with the service control manager. So just because you create it and then you say, hey, go start it, you're going to get a nice error and it's going to say, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. This thing doesn't exist, even though it's written in the registry. The system requires a reboot, and then it'll get loaded up, and then you'd be able to do your interaction with that service.
That's actually super cool because it almost like it has that like longer term persistence piece with it because you're not hitting SC on the command line, which most likely will be captured somewhere by somebody. And 7045s, I would hope most folks are tracking that to some degree, especially with Windows events. And then the WMI stuff, like is there a way for us to track that better? Like, do we get that with Sysmon or anything like that? Like, I mean, which, do you know which ED? Yeah. Is there an EDR that helps us here with any WMI type queries?
Some may have that capability. Some definitely don't.
Okay.
And so that's where a good defense in depth is going to occur. Just relying on I have EDR and it should give me all the things is probably not the greatest thing, but there's different, again, where we start to look and understand at the different methods that could be done from a depth perspective. That allows us to then focus on the different layers that we have of where the tools sit, where they can see it, and what they can't see, right? Because once we identify what we can't see, then we can try and figure out what can we use in order to fill that gap. Right, we all know detection drives prevention, prevention drives detection. So when we kind of think of it that way and start to understand the depth at which our tools can detect things, that kind of helps us put us into a better spot versus just saying, here's the newest C2 framework, what does it do? And then you go and look at the code at a lot of them, and they all use create service W, which follows the exact same API flow. And it results in the exact same thing. So you'll still get your 7045s, you'll still get your registry modifications, you'll even probably have some nice EDR data for some of that as well. Versus like an in-packet is just going to give you the RPC, has a different flow, but still end result of the 7045 as well as registry modifications.
That's awesome. And I had not messed with the atomic test harness piece enough yet, but I noticed that if you want, do you have the code nearby or standing by?
I do.
Yeah, I just like flipped through like the variants piece here. There's 4 different variants. The different start types and things like that. That's pretty awesome that these, it really helps like as a defender, if you really want to go through and validate your coverage and or visibility into these types of things. And like, even for like an EDR product, I mean, like years ago, everybody complained about the volume, but I think volumes, it's not solved. Like there's still a lot of data, right? But I mean, you may have to go and look at the registry for these things, but at least with these different variants, you can kick them off, test the different variants, see what you get in your telemetry. Maybe there's a gap, right? Like it's very awesome. That's one thing I really, really love about test harnesses. These are great.
Yeah. And what's interesting is when you're thinking of testing, especially against EDR, and you're trying to either A, buy one, or B, determine if you're going to switch is, does it record registry? Some do some filtering, some record everything. So it's really determines of like what you're ultimately looking for. But this is a great way, again, to just go with the different layers and the different methods, so that it's not just throw it against the wall and see what hits, or I'm only focused on, hey, here's 4 atomic red team tests. All 4 of those got seen, but the minute we change it up a little bit, now it's not detected. Now what? So I think it helps to, again, start with the breadth of coverage, which is where atomic red team starts out, and then atomic test harnesses allow us to focus and hone in on the specific techniques and go the depth of our ability to detect and potentially prevent the different things.
Yep. I had to plug it. I have a sysmon config that just kind of dumps everything that I always use in my ranges. Just gotta hunt naked. So I had to throw it in there. Yep. So collect everything.
Which reminds me, I should stop sysmon because it is collecting everything, because that is the that's the rule I use, or the config I use.
Hunt naked or go home. Awesome.
All right. So that's kind of a starter, but that's not the only type of service. That's a portion of service for like basic code execution or lateral movement or even persistence. Now, you have some interesting points on the other type of service, which is the drivers, the kernel drivers. So let's step into that. Let's touch on that.
Cool. You or me? What do you want me to do?
Well, that's you. The driver's not my piece. You're the expert. You're the.
Oh my gosh.
This is your ball game now.
Okay, share this thing up. All right, so so I have my notes. I'll drop this link as well into the channel there. I did a couple of presentations over the last, gosh, I can't believe it's been a year. I don't know why that one shows up, but it's under drivers, and under here, I did it for RSA Dark Arts, and then similar for, I think it was like the SANS threat hunting DFIR Summit. Just hunting Windows U-boats with cyber depth charges, as in Windows drivers. And I find this space really interesting because I feel like, so over time, the whole story is, right, over time, adversaries will bring in either a vulnerable driver, a signed driver, something into the environment that they're attacking, load it up either to elevate their privileges or to persist, right? And I've seen this in the past to where an adversary delivered a driver, installed it, and just sat there, and that's what we got, right? And I've seen too in the past where in 2 places now where it was missed, the driver piece was missed, and the only way we caught it was because the host was beaconing out to something. And another instance was we did driver inventory, and within the inventory was something highly suspect sitting on the host. So drivers are really interesting to me. And so I find this really cool. Check out the slides. There's some really neat things in there related to like signed drivers that were used by this group called Daxon. Daxon had a bunch of signed ones and everything like that. And there's some really cool, like, different changes that they did, and not changes, but just things that make it stand out, but also very hard for folks to see and do. Yep. Thank you, sir. I thought I had that. So I also, within that same repo, I have a C Wolf, just a simple setup of a driver. This uses the Capcom driver. It will copy it to the driver's directory. And again, you don't have to even put it in there. You could load up this driver from anywhere. And similar to what we saw with the atomic test harness and the atomic test, you can just standard sc create, give it your path, which again, it can be, execution of a command like what we saw with Paul. And in this case, now we're telling it to be a kernel type. And if you look at the atomic test harness code as well, I think there's 4 or 5. It has all the options, but kernels in there as well. So if you actually wanted to just rotate with the atomic test harness, you could just sit there and change the types, play with all the different ones and see what you get on the other side. or as we always say in Atomic, send it downrange, see what you find. And then it starts it, it outputs it, and things like that. And so again, this is just a Capcom driver. And I went ahead and I did two things. First, I ran the bat already earlier using the U527 name coming from the drivers directory. So copied it, ran it. And then I said, well, hey, like that's going to stand out just really quick. Like, why don't we also put it in the C users public and then do the same thing, start it and see what happens. So that's all I really changed. I am using the hunt naked sysmon config because again, you're not hunting naked, you're not really hunting. So this is the 7045 events that we've been talking about. I have it running in here. And you can see pretty quickly, you know, you have a driver or a sys file loading up out of the C users public path, and it does come up as a service type of kernel mode driver. You get the service name, like that happy display name and things like that. So it's all here, which is pretty cool. And then I think so I was messing with the Atomic test harness as well. And something that I was kind of goofing off with was just kind of playing with like some of the commands, but I didn't go as deep as what we saw with Paul. I just kind of was goofing off, just playing with, here I am trying to find it. But here's like the different registry pieces. So like sysmon data now in a sim, you know, what does it kind of look like from that regard? So here is the actual like target object of within current control set services. This is the driver, or the name that I had used was FMM, and then all the different pieces that there. So if you, we'll just pivot on that real quick, because that's actually probably more interesting in a way. It'll at least show us all the different pieces that were mapped. And similarly, what we saw in regedit, same type of things, same file, key objects and all that. It's kind of cool. Yeah, same. So this is just a query that I have where it's just saying, hey, of interest within any organization, a driver that is, you know, titled .sys has the extension .sys. If it's loading outside of sort of like these standard driver paths, I always think that's interesting because it typically means like some third-party software is loading up its own custom driver, a video game, a game, like, you know, whatever it might be loading something up. And that's really interesting to me. So in sysmon, you're looking at event code 6, what I think is driver load. And I'm just saying, show me everything that's not in the sort of like default paths. Every org will be different. Your default path might also be like printers and things like that. Or you might need to filter out certain things within your org. So add that there. And then just for kicks, I'm just going to remove that just so you can kind of see what it looks like coming from sysmon. And again, now we're just kind of seeing everything. And yeah, sysmon is not as rich as far as the telemetry goes for showing like binary data. Some EDRs will show you a full plethora of like everything from all the metadata from the PE itself. So if you want to do some really good hunting, I'd start there looking at drivers, just kind of like loading and looking around and seeing where they're at different places in your org. Yep, that's just the same thing and probably nothing as of interest. I don't know why I showed it twice. So, double tap it.
Question for you.
Yep.
Why are adversaries bringing in drivers? If I have the ability to run a system, then I pretty much own the system. What benefits or what are we seeing and why adversaries are bringing in drivers? What do you think?
I feel like it's just like a method to persist even longer. And I feel like a lot of orgs are not doing the inventory piece for drivers because it's kind of awkward and hard to go through and like look for drivers in your organization. Like I don't remember doing it much other than outside of the EDR tool that we had and other than like inside of a Splunk or something looking for drivers, but they could blend in a lot easier. They sit at that ring 0 within the kernel. So it's like, it's God mode. But again, it's like, why? If you're already admin, why would you need a kernel driver to be God mode, right? So I feel like it's more about persistence and just staying in that organization even longer. Yeah, what do you think? I don't have like the strongest opinion about it all, I guess.
Yeah, I don't have like a good answer. I like hypothesis, if you will, but I think especially vulnerable drivers bringing in for like code execution, to your point, like just stealthier and more like harder to remove. It's not just like, hey, go kill this process and then I'm good to go, right? There's a little bit more to it, especially sitting at like your point in the kernel space. There's a lot more, and then, but I think we're kind of, which we saw earlier, is some even commodity malware is using vulnerable drivers. And to your point, I think game dev anti-cheat systems are absolutely insane with this.
Oh yeah.
If you're interested in drivers, like the gaming space is a really good spot to go look at, especially from drivers and how anti-cheats work. There's a great No Starch Press book on that kind of digs into that, especially at that low level side of things. But I think it's an interesting thing we're going to start to potentially try and see more of. But I don't know if we just have some of the tools have the visibility to see that driver interaction or usage.
I think that's sort of I think it's awesome that drivers are becoming more of a topic now, because 2 years ago, I mean, I think they were talked about, but not as heavy as they are now, or as abused as they are now. And I also think, and I'm sure there's somebody out there or somebody will say that it's just like, yeah, you're wrong. But in my opinion, I think too that the reason why we don't see them abused 5 years ago is because nobody was looking for them being abused 5 years ago. Because a vulnerable driver, I can't just I'm looking at my screen right here and I see this Xbox one, right? I don't know. Looking at this alone doesn't tell me that this is malicious, or not malicious, but vulnerable. How do I know a driver is vulnerable? And to me, that's the hard part. It's just like, I could create a list based on what other people are saying are vulnerable, but there's this other one that is the unknown, right? And someone's going to pull it out of the woodworks and start dropping it on machines, but I don't know if it's malicious or vulnerable driver or anything like that. So it's a really weird whack-a-mole piece, and I don't think we see it in reports enough, because I don't think people are looking at it enough. There's just not visibility into it.
Well, what's interesting though is 4 years ago plus, you've co-wrote a blog about hunting drivers being abused. So it's funny because I feel like we're kind of like, hey, we did talk about it a few years back, and now it's kind of coming back in. But to your point, it's not there unless somebody's looking for it.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah,
it absolutely could be there, and it has probably been used and abused, but because we didn't look for those, we're not seeing the prevalence. But I think as we start to shine more of a light on it, I think it'll get more and more visibility. We're going to start to see more of it, right? Just kind of like Impact It. I guarantee you Impact has been used in incidents and breaches for years, but we weren't necessarily thinking about it, or, the connotation that it's only used by pen testers hindered the fact that we weren't looking for it. But I would put money that it's definitely been used, but we're starting to see it more and more.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's probably the exact same thing here, in that what's the word? I'm trying to think the right word. It's the what you have visibility into. It's the casting the net thing, right? That I shared on Twitter the other week. It's like, what you have visibility into is what you have visibility into, and you're going to say you catch everything based on that information. And if your EDR is filtering and you don't know what they're filtering, therefore you're just assuming that you have everything you need, based on that. And I don't know. It's interesting. I had to drop that word because it is a really interesting, hard problem to solve here with drivers, or even like you're saying, even with Impact It, like it could be used every day in every intrusion. But if you're not collecting the right data to know, you don't know. It's like, this is a good topic. Like, I think this is a really good point, because it's just like the LSAS stuff we were talking about. There's multiple tools that dump credentials, but it's classified as Mimikatz, not naming names, but you know what I mean? Like, it's
always Mimikatz. If there's
it's always
it's only Mimikatz. There's no other.
It's the only one.
No other tool that does it, right? So you just detect Mimikatz.
But you know what I mean? There's 25 ways to skim credentials, or skim cards, whatever you want to call it. But it's just like, it's not always Mimikatz.
Yeah. And let's say I took another method, like out mini dump, poured it to C#, and then named my binary Mimikatz. Is it really Mimikatz, right? Like, so you have that kind of the masquerading thing.
How do you know, as a defender on the other end of this, if you're just looking at create remote thread into LSAS, is it always Mimikatz based on, the granted access and the call trace? You're just like, it's Mimikatz, like stamp approved. You know what I mean? Like, it's
at that point though, does it matter what tool is used? The result is the same. Credentials were potentially dumped, right? If you're saying like, hey, I proved that credentials were dumped, at that point, who cares what tool is used? It may be a good after the fact, because if it was, hey, Mimikatz was literally downloaded straight from a GitHub repo, why didn't your tool see that, right? Like, yes, then it's trying to figure it out. So then you can go back and look. But at the time, I think sometimes we focus too much on like, what is that single C2 framework used in the middle of an incident, or what is that tool that was used? Who cares at that point, right? Like, the result is you had creds dumped, you had execution occur. We got to go respond to it, contain it, remediate it, and now we can go back and try and do some of that.
Yeah, it's right along the lines of go after the behavior, not the tool.
Yeah. And I
what was like the top threat recently that we saw? It was Cobalt. No, the top behavior was Cobalt Strike or something like that. You tweeted it out.
I was reading a report, and one of the things in this list of malware families was not like the same. And
I gotta
one
find
of
it.
them was Cobalt Strike, which we could probably get some intel people and researchers and other people and have a great table debate of, is Cobalt Strike a malware family? But I think there's been a lot of emphasis and focus on that type of stuff. But we're concerned with new hot C2 framework, the Beaverette C2 Sliver.
Here it is.
Mythic.
34% was Cobalt Strike, and then like Agent Tesla was number 2.
Which I don't get that grouping, because they're two separate things. But sure, again, probably above my pay grade of where I'm at, and some smart people could probably justify or clarify that. But here we are.
Yeah.
But yeah, kind of going back to it, which is when we think about, oh no, new C2 framework drops, how do I detect it, right? It's not necessarily the thing. You're looking at the behaviors that it does, right? If we go look at 5 open source frameworks and we look at the lateral movement aspect, I would put money that a lot of them are using the same API call to do the service execution for lateral movement from the service control manager of create service W. I know of 2 that are open source that use the exact same call, and the end result is the same. It goes to the exact same API flow. And I bet if we went and did that in other ones, I bet we'd find the exact same thing. So again, when we're focused on the behavior and how the things work versus the tool itself, we have a better understanding of what occurs, and we can drop and then start to focus on better detection at depth, which is a great starting point for, right to your point, which is I'm just getting started, Atomic Red Team, plethora of tests. I want to test the efficacy of my detection at depth. That's where atomic test harnesses come. They're really targeted. They're really specific to that technique and allow you to go to the levels without necessarily having to understand and go create them yourself. So I think that's where you can get really the combination of the two. Even though there may be some overlap, it really helps to just be able to throw it against the wall. See, should I know these things get caught from my EDR, MDR, NDR, whatever? Yeah. But then if I start to go at depth, now I can actually start to think about the different layered approach that I can look at, which I think is interesting.
Yep. I think the last thing I'll drop here is Elastic wrote. I put the blog in the channel there, but the Elastic team dropped a excellent blog a little while back on vulnerable drivers, and they also released a bunch of Yara rules, which I feel like they're going to be consistently updating as they kind of keep going here. But the idea is to use these Yara rules to, identify vulnerable ones in your org, potentially, using whatever method you can if you're using like Yara, right? And then going and they talk about allow listing and using WDAC and things like that. But yeah, I think it's a tricky topic. I think, yeah.
And I think two plugs here, which is one, the Elastic rules that they've publicly released are phenomenal. So if you're looking for ideas or potential